There is a very specific moment that happens inside an avoidant man's mind, and it happens far more often than he would ever admit out loud. He is sitting across from a woman, or reading a text from her, or simply remembering something she said, and a quiet, uncomfortable thought surfaces. She is not performing for me. That thought, small as it sounds, is one of the most disruptive things that can happen to a nervous system built around escape. Today, I want to walk through exactly what an avoidant man notices when he encounters a genuinely calm, unbothered woman. Not the performed version of calm, the real thing, because the noticing happens in layers, and almost nobody breaks it down piece by piece the way we are about to. If you are here because a man pulled away and you are trying to understand what is actually happening behind his silence, stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something about his internal experience that he probably cannot explain even to himself. Let's start with the baseline, because you cannot understand what he notices in a calm woman until you understand what he has spent his life noticing in everyone else. Avoidant attachment is not really about avoiding people. It is about avoiding a specific feeling, the feeling of being trapped, obligated, or overwhelmed by someone else's emotional needs. That pattern usually formed early, often in childhood, in an environment where love came with strings attached, where affection had to be earned through performance, where closeness meant slowly losing yourself to keep someone else comfortable. So as adults, avoidant men walk into relationships with a nervous system quietly scanning for the moment things are going to start requiring something of them that they do not know how to give. Because of that scanning, avoidant men become almost accidentally experts at detecting performance in other people. They have spent years watching partners manage their moods, soften their requests, apologize preemptively, mirror their energy back at them in an attempt to stay safe or stay close. Most people do not realize how much of their behavior in a relationship is, in some sense, a performance for the other person's comfort. Avoidant men notice this constantly, even when they cannot name what they are noticing. It shows up as a low background hum of pressure, a sense that every interaction requires a response, a reaction, an adjustment on his part. And that hum is exhausting to a person whose entire coping strategy is built around minimizing emotional demand. So here is the first thing an avoidant man notices in a genuinely calm woman. The hum is gone. He cannot find it, no matter how closely he listens for it. There is no performance humming underneath her words. There is no test buried inside her tone. There is no subtext demanding a specific response from him. And the absence of that hum is initially deeply confusing because he has never encountered silence like that before. Silence that is not a strategy. Silence that is simply silence. The second thing he notices is what happens when he pulls away. Most people, understandably, respond to distance with some version of anxious energy, whether that is chasing, over-explaining, or a wounded withdrawal designed, even unconsciously, to provoke guilt. A calm woman does something different, and it is subtle enough that it takes him time to consciously register it. She notices the distance. She might even name it plainly, without accusation, something like, "I have noticed you have been quieter lately. Is everything okay?" And then she waits. She does not fill the silence with anxious guesses, dressed up as certainty. She does not spiral into three competing stories about what his quietness means. She simply waits for an actual answer and continues with her day while she waits. That waiting, without punishment attached to it, is almost unheard of to a man used to chaos following any gap in communication. And he notices it precisely because it does not match anything in his internal catalog of what happens after he creates distance. His brain has a whole library of expected reactions, and hers does not fit any entry in it. The third thing he notices, and this one tends to land slower, is that her mood does not seem to be downstream of his behavior. Most relationships, even healthy ones, involve some degree of emotional interdependence, where one partner's bad day affects the others, where distance from one person creates a ripple in the other. An avoidant man is used to being, in some sense, the emotional weather system of his relationships, whether he wants that role or not. When he withdraws, he expects to see some visible effect, a change in tone, a shortened reply, a flicker of hurt in her voice the next time they speak. With a genuinely calm woman, he looks for that flicker and cannot find it. Not because she does not care, but because her sense of okayness was never fully outsourced to him in the first place. And a man who has spent his whole adult life managing the emotional temperature of every relationship he has been in does not know what to do with someone who has her own thermostat. The fourth thing he notices is in the small digital signals, the texting patterns that people rarely talk about directly, but that everyone feels on some level. A woman running on anxious energy will often mirror his pace exactly, or worse, escalate past it, sending a second message before the first has been answered, adding explanations nobody asked for, softening every request until it barely resembles a request at all. A calm woman texts the way she lives, clear, warm, unhurried. She does not send 3 messages when one will do. She does not apologize for taking a day to reply if her day was genuinely full. She is not cold in her messages, she simply is not performing an urgency she does not feel. And an avoidant man who has spent years associating notification sounds with obligation and pressure experiences her texts as something closer to relief. No demand hiding underneath the words, no test buried inside the punctuation. Just a person communicating like a person, which sounds almost too simple until you realize how rare it actually is. The fifth thing he notices, and this is the one that tends to unsettle him the most, is that she is not afraid of the relationship ending. Not because she does not care about him, but because she has survived endings before and knows from lived experience rather than theory that she would survive another one. That lack of desperation quietly removes a form of leverage he did not even know he was relying on. He cannot dangle the threat of leaving over someone who has already made a quiet peace with the possibility. And a relationship without that particular leverage forces him to actually show up as a person, rather than as someone managing another person's fear of abandonment on his behalf. Now, here is something important to understand about how he processes all of this noticing, because it does not arrive all at once, and it does not feel like admiration at first. It usually feels like discomfort. Avoidant men test people, not maliciously, not as a conscious strategy, but instinctively, almost as a reflex built out of self-protection. They pull away to see what happens next. If a partner chases, part of him feels temporarily soothed because it confirms he is wanted. But another part feels suffocated because now there is pressure to reciprocate something he is not sure he can safely give. If a partner disappears too, part of him feels relieved because the threat of closeness has evaporated. But another part feels a fresh grief, a confirmation that closeness always ends in loss, exactly the way he expected it would. A calm, unbothered woman does neither of those things, and that is precisely what he notices next: the absence of a predictable ending to the test. She does not chase. She does not disappear in a dramatic exit designed, even unconsciously, to provoke a reaction out of him. She simply steps back to a comfortable distance and continues her life without spectacle, without narrating it to him or anyone else. There is no performance in it for him to detect. And because there is no performance, he cannot locate the manipulation his whole life has trained him to expect and defend against. He searches for the angle. He searches for the game underneath her calm. And there is none there to find. That absence, the absence of a game where he expected one, is one of the most disorienting and, over time, one of the most magnetic things he can encounter. I want to be very specific here about what he notices next, because this is where the internal experience shifts from confusion into something closer to fascination. He starts noticing that she does not outsource her identity to the relationship. A lot of people, especially earlier in their relationship history, unconsciously let a relationship become the main event of their lives, letting friendships, hobbies, and ambitions slowly get deprioritized in favor of managing the relationship and staying attuned to someone else's moods. A woman who has done real internal work has usually already learned that this is a trap. She keeps her friendships alive. She keeps her interests alive. She keeps her own goals moving forward, regardless of what is happening romantically. So when he creates distance, there is no visible vacuum for him to notice, because her life was never structured entirely around him to begin with. And a man who is used to being, whether he likes it or not, the center of someone else's emotional universe does not quite know what to do with someone whose universe was never centered on him in the first place. He also notices how she communicates boundaries. This one is subtle, but it lands with real weight over time. Less experienced communication often blends boundaries with emotional consequences attached to them. The silent treatment, withdrawn affection, an argument escalated specifically to force change. A woman who has done real work tends to state boundaries plainly and then simply follow through, without drama, without needing him to feel bad about it afterward. Something like, I am not available for last-minute plans anymore. I need consistency to feel secure in this. If that does not work for you, I understand, but it will not work for me either, said calmly, without anger underneath it. He notices that it lands completely differently than the same words delivered in the middle of a fight, because there is nothing to defend against. There is only information offered plainly without a hidden agenda attached to it. Now, I want to be very clear about something, because this next part matters enormously, and it is where a lot of well-meaning advice quietly goes wrong. None of what he is noticing is the result of a strategy. This is not a technique that can be faked convincingly for very long. If a woman tries to perform calm detachment while secretly falling apart internally, checking her phone every few minutes, and rehearsing what she will say if he finally reaches out, it will not work the same way, because avoidant men are, ironically, often extremely sensitive to inconsistency between what someone says and what they actually feel underneath it. Their whole life has trained them to detect a gap between performance and reality as a survival skill, because that gap was often dangerous for them as children. What he notices and responds to is not the appearance of independence, it is the reality of it. The security has to be real. The life has to actually be full. The peace has to actually be earned, not staged for an audience of one. This is exactly why so many attempts to copy this energy backfire. A woman reads about attachment styles, decides to try being unbothered, stops replying quickly, acts busy, plays it cool on the surface, while internally spiraling underneath it. And an avoidant man can often sense that gap almost instinctively, even if he cannot articulate exactly what feels off. What he is actually noticing and responding to only works because it is not an act. It comes from years of genuinely building a life that does not depend on any one person's presence in it. And that kind of security has a texture that performed detachment simply does not have. So if you are listening to this thinking, okay, but I do not feel calm and unbothered right now, here is the part that should actually encourage you. What he notices is not a personality trait you either have or do not have. It is a level of self-possession, and self-possession can be built deliberately at any age through specific, repeatable practice rather than waiting passively for time or circumstance to hand it to you. Let's talk about how that gets built, because I do not want to leave you with an observation and no direction. The first shift is learning to separate your sense of safety from someone else's behavior. This sounds abstract, but it is actually very practical. It means noticing when your nervous system starts spiraling because someone went quiet, and instead of immediately trying to fix the silence, asking yourself, what do I actually know right now, versus what am I imagining? Most anxious spirals are built almost entirely out of imagined scenarios, not actual information. Learning to sit with not knowing without catastrophizing every gap in communication is one of the most powerful skills you can develop, and it is exactly the skill that emotionally secure people tend to have refined through repetition, often the hard way. The second shift is rebuilding a life that exists independently of your relationship status. Not as a strategy to make anyone chase you, but because you genuinely deserve a full life, regardless of what any one person decides to do. Reconnect with the friendships that have gone quiet. Pick back up the hobby you dropped when things got serious. Set goals that have nothing to do with your relationship at all. This is not about becoming unavailable to punish anyone. It is about becoming so genuinely occupied by your own life that someone else's distance does not create a crater. It just creates a small, manageable gap that your life naturally fills back in on its own. The third shift, and this is the one people resist the most, is releasing the fantasy that you can love someone into becoming secure. You cannot. I know that is hard to hear, especially if you are deeply invested in someone right now. But healing an avoidant attachment style is work that has to happen inside the person who has it. You can be patient, you can be understanding, you can create a safe, consistent environment for someone. But the actual transformation has to come from him, through his own choice, his own reflection, his own willingness to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. Your job is not to fix him. Your job is to decide whether the relationship as it currently exists is one you actually want to stay in. Here is something worth sitting with because it reframes everything we have covered so far. When an avoidant man becomes fixated on a calm, unbothered woman, it is rarely because she did anything specifically engineered to affect him. It is because she reflected something back to him that he had never fully confronted. The fact that real intimacy does not require him to lose himself, and the fact that real safety does not have to be earned through control. That realization can be incredibly attractive, and it can also be incredibly threatening, sometimes at the exact same time. Which is why some avoidant men, faced with exactly this kind of steadiness, do not move toward it at all. They retreat further and faster because the possibility of a healthy relationship can feel more dangerous to their identity than the familiar pain of an unhealthy one. This matters because it means what he notices does not automatically lead to a happy ending. Sometimes it results in a man finally doing the internal work and showing up differently over time if he chooses to. Sometimes it results in him running so far and so fast that the relationship simply ends, while he spends months or years quietly comparing every future partner to the one who never chased him. Either outcome is, in its own way, a form of respect, even if it does not feel like that in the moment, because in both cases, the woman in question was never diminished by his response. She did not need his fascination to validate her worth, and she does not need his healing to complete her own story. One of the more fascinating parts of this dynamic is how avoidant men often narrate the relationship to themselves afterward, once enough time has passed. In the moment, while it is happening, they might genuinely believe they are the ones in control, deciding how much closeness to allow, setting the pace entirely on their own terms. But months later, sometimes years later, something shifts. They start reframing the story. What once felt like control starts to feel like loss. What once felt like independence starts to feel like abandonment, except this time self-inflicted. This delayed processing is incredibly common with avoidant attachment because in the moment of closeness, the nervous system is too busy managing perceived threat to actually register what is happening emotionally in real time. It is only later, once the threat is gone, once the relationship has ended or faded, that the full weight of what he experienced finally lands. This is why you sometimes hear about avoidant men reaching out months after things ended, seemingly out of nowhere, with a level of clarity and regret that was completely absent while things were actually happening. It is not that new information came to light. It is that his nervous system finally had enough distance to process what it could not process up close. For a self-possessed woman, this delayed reckoning rarely destabilizes her because by the time it arrives, she is usually already moved forward. She is not sitting around waiting for closure. She built her own closure the moment she decided her peace mattered more than his timeline. I also want to address something that comes up constantly whenever this topic gets discussed, which is whether all of this is just a fancy way of describing playing hard to get. It is not, and the distinction matters enormously. Playing hard to get is a strategy performed for an audience of one, designed specifically to manipulate someone's interest. What we are describing here is the opposite. It is a woman who has built a full life for herself, for her own sake, completely independent of whether any particular man notices or responds to it. What he notices happens as a side consequence, not as the goal. And that distinction is exactly why it cannot be faked convincingly for very long. Genuine self-possession has a texture that performed detachment simply does not have. And people who have spent their whole lives scanning for authenticity as a defense mechanism tend to notice the difference eventually, whether they can articulate why or not. There is also a status and comparison element worth naming directly because it plays a bigger role in what he notices than people usually admit. Avoidant men, like most people, are influenced by social proof. Even if they would never say that out loud, watching someone who is clearly desired by others, who has options, who is visibly not sitting around waiting, activates something fairly primal. It is not about competition in a shallow, ego-driven sense, though sometimes that is part of it. It is more about an unconscious recalibration of value happening underneath the surface. If other people are drawn to her and she is not desperate for his attention specifically, his brain starts assigning her a different category than the people who make themselves entirely available to him without being asked. There is also a life stage element worth naming because it changes how sharply he notices all of this, depending on how much relational history he is carrying. A man who has been running this pattern for a long time, through relationship after relationship that ended the same disappointing way, has more evidence stacked up that something in his approach is not working, even if he has never said that out loud to anyone, including himself. That accumulation matters. It means when he encounters a woman who is calm, grounded, and clearly not auditioning for his approval, the contrast lands harder because he is not comparing her to one person. He is comparing her to a lifetime pattern of chasing, retreating, and being chased in return. And for what might be the first time, none of his old moves seem to apply to her at all. It is worth pausing on how gradually this noticing tends to unfold, because it rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It usually happens across a series of small interactions, each one slightly recalibrating what he expects from her. The first time she does not chase after he goes quiet, he notices it, but he may not trust it yet. Part of him assumes it is a delayed reaction, that the anxious response is simply coming later than usual. When it does not come, he notices that too, and files it away without quite knowing what to do with it. The second time it happens, the pattern starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like information about who she actually is. By the third or fourth time, something shifts internally, and the noticing stops being conscious analysis and starts becoming an assumption baked into how he relates to her. He stops bracing for the reaction that never came because his nervous system has started to learn slowly that it is genuinely not coming. This is part of why rushing this process, or trying to manufacture it through a single dramatic display of independence, rarely works the way people hope it will. What he is noticing is not a single data point. It is a pattern repeated consistently enough that his nervous system, which has been trained by years of a very different pattern, starts to update its expectations. That kind of update takes repetition, not intensity. One calm response does not undo years of anticipating chaos. 10 calm responses delivered without inconsistency start to. It is also worth understanding what he notices when the calm eventually gets tested by something real, not just his own withdrawal, but an actual disagreement or a genuine hurt. A woman performing detachment tends to either collapse into anxious repair mode the moment real conflict shows up, or overcorrect into cold withdrawal to prove a point. A woman whose calm is real behaves differently, even under real strain. She can be upset without becoming unstable. She can say something firm without it curdling into an attack. She can sit inside a disagreement without needing it resolved in the next 5 minutes to feel okay. He notices that her steadiness is not conditional on nothing ever going wrong. It holds up specifically when something does go wrong, which is the only real test of whether it was ever genuine in the first place. Something else worth naming here is what he notices about how she talks about other people in her life, not just how she treats him directly. A woman who has built genuine security tends to speak about her friends, her work, her interests with the same steady, unhurried energy she brings to the relationship itself. There is no performance in how she describes her life to him, no subtle attempt to make him jealous, no exaggeration designed to provoke a reaction. She simply talks about her life the way someone talks about something that is actually theirs. And an avoidant man who has spent years scanning for hidden agendas in almost every conversation notices the absence of an agenda here too. Her life sounds real because it is real, and that realness is oddly difficult to argue with or dismiss, even for someone whose instinct is to look for the catch. So where does this leave you? If you recognize yourself somewhere in this, either as the woman trying to understand a man who keeps pulling away, or as someone trying to become the kind of person who no longer bends herself out of shape, waiting for someone else's fear to resolve, the path forward is not about becoming cold. It is not about weaponizing indifference. It is about genuinely, patiently, deliberately building a life so full and so anchored that your emotional well-being stops depending on someone else's ability to show up consistently. That process takes time. It is not a weekend project. It involves real grief sometimes, real disappointment, real moments of wanting to go back to old patterns simply because they feel familiar, even when familiar is not the same thing as good for you. But on the other side of that work is something genuinely freeing. You stop asking whether you are enough to make someone stay. You start asking instead whether someone is actually capable of matching the life you have already built for yourself. That is not arrogance. That is self-respect, applied consistently, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is lonely, even when part of you still wishes the old pattern would somehow work out differently this time. If this helped you understand something about a man, or maybe more importantly, something about yourself, stay with me because we are going deeper into exactly these patterns every single week. Real psychology, no fluff, no shame, just clarity about why the people you love behave the way they behave. And more importantly, how you build a life strong enough that their behavior stops determining your peace. Before you go, tell me honestly, have you ever watched someone's entire energy shift the moment you got quiet, calm, and unbothered instead of anxious? Have you ever noticed someone paying closer attention precisely when you stopped trying to earn it? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. And whatever you are going through right now, someone else in that comment section has been exactly where you are and made it to the other side. You were never too much. You were simply too full of life for someone who was still afraid of living fully himself. And the moment you stop shrinking to make that comfortable for him, everything changes. Not because you tried to change it, but because you finally stopped negotiating your own worth in exchange for someone else's comfort.